Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I should apologise, I'm not my normal erudite self in that I have a medical treatment on my throat currently, which means things are a little bit more difficult for me today than normally. But anyway, let's get on with this. Mutualising fairness across the AI ecosystem, digital self-determination and responsible access. These slides are drawn primarily from two areas of the Centre's work. One is our AI Ethics Hub, and the other is our work on digital self-determination. And I'm trying to draw them together under the umbrella of fairness. And this applies not only to the public sector, but to the private sector, and particularly now in the environments such as post-pandemic control situations where public and private data is being combined and shared. Okay. The purpose of the presentation today is to go down two paths. One is to look at mutualised fairness, to describe the nature and the dynamics of the ecosystems within which AI and big data operate, highlight the struggle between market motivation and public good, and then to go on to talk specifically about digital self-determination in advancing mutualised fairness. These slides are very full over the next 10 minutes or so, and I will speak to some elements within them. I'm sure I could give access to them if there are elements in the slides that you would like to look at more closely. Mutualised fairness, what do we mean by that? Well, in most decisions and their outcomes, fairness is key in determining what is legitimate and what is not. And fairness has specific directions, recipients and benefits. But how do we settle on a universal notion of fairness? A common understanding of fairness, we think, is best not through definitions, but through implementation. And we argue that fairness must be shared. And this is the outcome of the research that we've done, which indicates mutualised responsibility across the ecosystem will ensure fair outcomes in a more likely way. The responsibility to be fair. Attribution for achieving a fair outcome. Where does it locate? Where does it sit? It is the activation of a duty or responsibility to share processes that achieve outcomes which are fair. Once responsibility is attributed communally and distributed across all players in decision sites in the ecosystem, then shared fairness will be achieved. But we found in the research that we've done that many people who participate in key decision roles in the ecosystem believe that fairness is an issue for somebody else, and that they're under the pressure of commercial and market exigencies which take control over what it is that they must consider. Starting out to be fair, the role of data science. There's some fabulous work being done now in the philosophy of data science, which talks about a shift in the way in which data science is operating. It talks about a relational view in terms of data. It's not just data being objective or independent, which we know is not true, but looking at the use and development and application of data in commercial or social terms. And so data science is a process in many respects of producing knowledge as much as it is distilling knowledge from other sources. And when we're looking at interpreting data and the way in which it can influence the process of AI, we strongly believe in the importance of cultivating grassroots data governance strategies from the bottom up. And let's see how that works. This little circular presentation is something that a data scientist, Leonelli, has suggested is useful. Knowledge moving to interactions, onto objects, then to data, then to models, and back to knowledge again, so that data becomes part of this knowledge creation flow. And where individuals sit in this cycle is important as to whether they can understand the need to be fair or otherwise. AI and big data ecosystems, pathways to fairness. Let me give you just a quick outline of what an ecosystem is. It's a chain of important decision sites where fairness is prioritized among other market players. It's a pipeline. It's personalized. There are hierarchies based on power, position, and productivity. And it's a conversation between different teams, between different individuals. But what are the impediments in the ecosystem against conversations about fairness? And what are the competing and conflictual dominant motivations over AI and data use? In the work that we've done on ethical conversations through the ecosystems, we've talked to the boardroom and down to the shop floor. And we've asked these sorts of questions. Are ethical principles expressed in ways that make sense across the ecosystem? If a decision raises an ethical challenge, whose responsibility is it to solve that challenge? What worries AI developers about ethical applications? And you could go through the list. It basically indicates the structure that we had for the way in which we chose to conduct these different research exercises. And we looked at large companies, we looked at consultancies, small consultancies and startups, we looked at public sector operations in terms of the way in which data was being used and exercised. And it became very clear that for different players in the system who had different important roles to exercise in terms of decision making, there was a tension between ethical responsibility and market compatibility. And this was often felt much more significantly down the line, the further you went towards the young millennial who was doing the design work on the shop floor. What we found out in terms of the truth about ethics in the ecosystem was rather surprising. There's confusion about who has responsibility for ethical practice, market pressures that are personally felt to reduce the time for thinking about these issues, genuine interest in understanding the relationship between ethical standards and principles. I'd like $1 for every time I'm approached by a data scientist or a technician who says, just explain to me what we should do. And largely the question is what we should do so that we don't get into trouble. Uncertainty about whether and what extent where they sit in the chain of development experiences ethical challenges. So they're placed in the system. The importance of fairness as an ethical priority. That was the big word that came out. Fairness, fairness, fairness. The inaccessibility of ethical language. Many designers felt a lot of this stuff didn't make sense. Transparency, how can you explain an algorithm to someone who doesn't know their maths? And then the importance of language, excuse me, the different languages used by those who are in social science and those who are not. We suggest the question is not so much about trustworthy technology, but rather the fair use of data, a balance between the individual and the collective sentiments, which was terribly important when discussing your position in the organization. How can we create shared responsibility? How can commercial, political, and economic interests be committed to creating data sovereignty in worlds where we talk about data ownership, data trade, data commodification, data rights? The work that we're doing on digital self-determination says, let's get rid of that language and let's start talking about responsible access and sharing which is fair. And there are, excuse me, jurisdictions in Europe in particular that are looking at the issue of responsible access, particularly in terms of data reuse, against the concept of public good, which is important. Digital self-determination, what is it? I'd like some time, but I don't have it, to explain this exciting new concept. It's about looking at the digital world. It's about looking at safe data spaces and dealing with data relationships around respectful and fair relationships. It's about the self, primarily going from the data subject and out to others in their community. And it's determination. It's giving genuine, informed choice to those who are the producers of this data largely. In so many situations, the problem with fair data use is about I don't know. And some countries now, China interestingly is one, are saying that if data is being used about a data subject and the data subject does not know, they should be informed. The fairness approach, it's a rejection of the language that I've talked about before, ownership, possession, sovereignty and rights. Replace it with language of empowerment, where data subjects can manage their data excuse me, and work in an informed context. Repositioning law so that law can withdraw from creating private property rights excuse me, and move into the realm of protecting fair access, opening up access, and then returning some position of power to those who make fundamental decisions about what happens to data. Finally, the data reuse case study is interesting. If you look at data reuse, you'll find that in so many situations, the reuse of data happens and the commercialization, the marketization of data happens in situations where the data subject is not informed. Take the individual who delivers your food for Deliveroo or the, excuse me, the Grab driver. They have no concept of the way in which their secondary data is being used. And to some extent, the importance of fairness in that reuse becomes clear. If data subjects were excluded from data sharing, then in many respects, the value of data gets skewed. It's only talked about in terms of money and rarely ever talked about in terms of the value of the data subject. What the data subject says is valuable in relation to that data. So we say that it's important, particularly with digital self-determination, which will excite people on the basis of fair access to move away from old concepts and move towards this idea of responsible and fair sharing in safe digital spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mark. That was an interesting conversation. And thank you for taking the time today despite your health. Thank you so much. We have some questions from the audience. And let me get to the first question we have. So in terms of fairness and data privacy, which country do you think is the role model in the current world?
Well, the answer is none, because the question is looking at data the wrong way. The majority of people whose data is used have no chance of claiming privacy. Look at the majority of young people who use social media platforms. They can't claim privacy because they consent to massive personal data use just to use the platform. So in many respects, I think the issue is not so much how do I keep my data from other people, but rather how can I ensure that I know firstly what is happening with my data, and secondly, who's using it. And that's interesting. Some of the countries that you would least expect, China, for example, and some of the EU countries, India is thinking about this now, questions not just about data privacy or the old-fashioned personal data protection model, but rather how do we get data subjects aware of the use of their data and give them a say in where it ends up.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. So our next question is, do you think government should highly involved in fairness issues, like we just said about China? And because there are some companies have highly used data without privacy concerns. And that, I think, point to how the new generation is using data.
Yeah, look, could I ask us to move away from privacy as the measure of fairness? Because I don't think it is. About 80% of the world see privacy as a luxury. So we're largely talking about privacy in relation to data, to those people who can claim a right to keep it. I think what's much more important, and government should set a lead in this, is talking about fairness in terms of how we use data. Not how we protect it or how we keep it from other people, but rather how are the access modes operating? Are they operating fairly, firstly, for the data subject, and then secondly, for the people who want to use the data in a secondary or a tertiary source. And currently, so much of the data use that's occurring worldwide is occurring in a market model without the involvement of the data subject. France has just moved on this and introduced some very interesting legislation on data reuse in terms of the public good, considering the importance of the fact that for the majority of young people in particular who produce their personal data, which then becomes advertising fodder, there should be a genuine concern about the extent to which they are involved in the management of that data. Not so much protecting it, but rather having a say in the way in which it's used.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. One more question on, we are on the subject of fairness, the definition of fairness and how subjective it is. So do you think setting on a universal notion on fairness makes AI impossible to regulate?
No, not at all. I think, as I suggested in the slides, fairness is about doing something, not defining something. It's interesting, you know, if we sat around the table and we all asked each other to define fairness, we'd have a problem. But if I said to you, I'm going to do this to you, do you think it's fair? You'd know whether it was fair or not. So it's very much the concept of a process in a context. Now, in the work that we've done with young designers and with young AI technicians in particular, they know exactly what fairness is. But they often have to qualify that because of the pressure of the client, the pressure of market demand, those externalities which they have no control over. Now, what I would challenge, particularly the big tech companies and the big data harvesters and storers, is to open up the conversation in their companies with those at all levels of the ecosystem to see what they consider to be fair. And then, in various contexts, do some hypotheticals, in various contexts, say to individuals at different levels, what's stopping you from being fair in the use of data? You know, algorithmic justice always surprises me because the algorithm is not unjust. What's unjust is the data that's fed into it and the decisions that are fed out. And so in many respects, the real question becomes for me, the way in which we have expectations for the process of algorithmic decision making. And so often the problem originates with the data that's fed in rather than necessarily what the algorithm does to it.
I agree totally with that. And on that note, there is another question on how responsible we should be as a technologist. Should we be sued like a doctor if we malpractice or if we use the data unfairly?
Well, I think the likelihood of that is 0 to nothing. I mean, the governments can't even work out what to do with autonomous vehicles, let alone suing AI professionals for the misuse of data. I think what will happen is more important, that those people who are identified as misusing data won't be sued, but they'll just be stopped from accessing other people's data. If I'm a big data storer and you're a data user and you abuse that data, I'm not going to let you use it. So it's much more hurtful to you, much more deterrent to you as a big data user, not for me to get a court order and fine you $2 million or something for the mistake that some data technician has made, but rather to say, all right, you pay the price, and the price is you abuse that data, you misuse that data, you're not getting any more. And this happens in many commercial situations. Don't think this is idealistic. The US courts have worked on corporate probation for years, where companies have been removed out of market practice simply because their corporate behavior is unacceptable. And I think that's the key. The key is, do we want, as market players, to police fairness? And once we do that, once we tell the people working in our team, fairness means something, it's important, we value it, and we're going to stand by you if you're fair, then they'll be fair.
Thank you, Professor Mark. I think for today, we are at the end of our time here. And thank you so much. It was such an amazing talking to you and listen to your presentation. Thank you for your time today. Now I will hand over to Tran to introduce our upcoming speakers. Over to you, Tran.
Thank you very much, Professor Findlay, and thank you all for your participation and questions.